G'day everyone and welcome to a special video for the Legal Studies guy. Obviously we have an exam. If you're watching this as soon as I've uploaded it, you have an exam in 6 days. So an exam absolutely coming up soon. And I just wanted to post you a short video where I'm going to share with you what I think is the #1 tip for the Legal Studies exam. Now, to do this, I'm going to show you a question and we're going to talk about how to approach this question, because my #1 tip is an approach to answering questions that you can hopefully learn in a few days and apply on the run in the exam if you haven't already. The most common thing that comes up in the examiner's report about why students don't go so well on certain questions is simply that they approach the question in the wrong way. They don't actually address the question or answer what the question's asking. So this little strategy I'm going to give you does that. Now, I should say that obviously we've got a longer video that goes into a really in-depth process for how to answer longer response questions. I recommend you check that out if you haven't already. This is very much going to be a much quicker, hey, you can do this for any question on the exam to make sure that you talk about what you're meant to talk about. Now, I've heard many teachers use different acronyms and things over the years. I think this one's used by many teachers as well. But the #1 tip I'm going to give you for next week is to make sure that you show every question on the exam TLC. So a bit of tender, love and care. Now, what do these 3 letters mean? Well, first of all, before we think about anything else, the first thing you need to do on any question is figure out what the task word is. Okay? What skill do you need to show? In this question, and this question was last year's exam, question 6, okay, the task word's very clearly evaluate. Now, the key with evaluate, as we know if you've been watching my videos, is that whatever we're looking at, we need to look at both sides, and we need to have an overall argument, which is something that a lot of kids miss with evaluation questions. Okay, you've actually got to tell me how good something is. The L, after we've figured out what the task word is check if the question has any limiters. Okay, now there's a couple of limiters in this question, and we're not going to know the second one until we look at the C of the question, but the first limiter is really clearly 2. Okay, the most common limiter in legal studies is when it says like you can only evaluate 2 ways, or you can only explain 1 way or 1 purpose. Now, this is an important limiter because if something says explain 1 way and you start doing or explaining a second way in your answer, none of that counts anymore. They can only count the first way that you identify. Same with this question. If you're evaluating 2 ways and you start talking about a third, none of that counts. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of breath. So you can only talk about 2 ways. Now, there's another limiter in this question that I'm going to come back to in a moment, because I want to talk about the third part of this acronym, which is content. Okay, so it's only once we know what we need to do and we check for any limiters that we actually look at the content. And the content of this question is, we'll underline it, ways in which the Australian Constitution acts as a check on Parliament in lawmaking. Now, hopefully you can straight away identify, this is area 4.1. Yeah? And in area 4.1, the study design lists 5 ways in which the Constitution acts as a check on Parliament in lawmaking. Those 5 ways are express rights, role of the High Court, the bicameral structure of Parliament, the separation of powers, and I am missing double majority. So the double majority provision for a referendum. Now, great. There's 5 things, and we can talk about any 2 of those, and we can evaluate any 2 of those. Except where this question really tripped people up last year, and a fact we need to know, is that now we know the content, we need to actually identify the second limiter in this question. Okay? And this second limiter is this. enables the Australian people. Okay? And this is an important limiter in this question because some of these checks here, some of these 5, don't actually have anything to do with the Australian people or don't involve the Australian people unless you present them in the right way. Okay? And that's what differentiates, if you break down this question properly, that's what differentiates a strong student from a weaker student. Okay? A weaker student who might know the content and know what they need to talk about, but can't actually target the question and break down what needs to be done. Now, for example, if I look at the 5 ways in which the Constitution acts as a check on Parliament in lawmaking, you'll note the separation of powers. Judicial, executive, legislature. The idea that there's no abuses, that each of them have certain roles they play. Okay? Great. Doesn't really involve the people, apart from the fact hopefully the people aren't getting screwed over. But it doesn't actually enable the Australian people to do anything. So therefore, you can't talk about the separation of powers to answer this question. Okay? Let's look at another one. Express rights. Great. Parliament can't make laws in those areas. They're in the Constitution. Do they enable the Australian people to do anything? Well, kind of, but only if the Australian people take the matter to the High Court to say that legislation's breached their rights. So in a way, express rights is off, but the role of the High Court is on because the Australian people are enabled. They can take matters to the High Court. So that's a piece of content we can talk about. Okay? The other big one here, I mean, bicameral structure works a little bit because we're obviously voting and there's different voting methods. But the other big one that I really want to look at is double majority. And it obviously fits in here because double majority is the whole idea that the Constitution can't be changed without the consent of the Australian people. So the Australian people act as a check on Parliament in lawmaking because Parliament can't add new lawmaking powers through a referendum without the consent of the Australian people. So through the double majority, the Australian people are a check on Parliament in lawmaking. Now, what looked like a really broad question, evaluate 2 of the 5 ways in which the Australian Constitution acts as a check on Parliament in lawmaking, in reality, we can only properly talk about 2 of these ways. Okay? And if you talked about any of the others, you're actually not targeting the question anymore. Now, there's a question every year that does this, that adds in a little section like this one here, that just gets you thinking that little bit more, that really separates the strong students from the weak. And that's why it is so important to make sure that you basically, whether you've got a different process that you use to break down a question or you use this one, the TLC method, that you really read the question for those limiters particularly. Okay? What restrictions does the question place on you and what you can talk about? And if you can do that, then you're well on your way to having a fantastic exam. So ultimately, my number 1 tip, apart from specifically showing every question tender, love and care, that TLC, my number 1 tip is to make sure that you think about the question, that you break it down, that you figure out what it wants you to do. Okay? Not what you think it might want you to do. Okay? Not just what the content says without looking at the task word. What does it really want you to do? And in this case, it really wants you to evaluate the role of the High Court, and particularly how the people can use the High Court to check Parliament, and how the people act as the ultimate check through a referendum to the adding of new lawmaking powers to the Constitution. Remember, if you haven't already, on YouTube we also have another exam tips video that has 5 exam tips, a bit more broad and general, that I'd recommend you check out. And we also have some practice exams available on our website. I'll put the link down in the bio, thelegalstudiesguide.com/store. They're really well priced compared to competitors. You get 2 practice exams and solutions for $40, or you can buy a combined set of this year's and last year's for $60 total. So if you're looking for some last minute, I suppose, practice exams to do, or particularly 4 sets of sample answers, I'd recommend you get over there and check them out and maybe invest. All proceeds go towards making sure that we can continue to make content, continue to keep the website up and running, and we appreciate all your support throughout the year. If you don't hear from me again, absolutely all the best for next Tuesday. I know you'll knock it out of the park. And yeah, looking forward to hopefully you're looking forward to finishing your exams and celebrating the summer ahead. Cheers.